To our next, please.
Pauline Irving. Are the government warriors for the dispossessed or warriors for the privileged?
This is a reference to a speech in which the former Education Secretary, now Chief Whip, Michael Gove, said, amongst other things, that it was vital for the Tory campaign to tackle claims that the Prime Minister wanted only to shrink the state and defend the wealthy. Only, he said, if we remind people of our commitment to social justice, demonstrate our belief in equality of opportunity, and affirm that we are warriors for the dispossessed, will we be able to win the arguments and elections. Ken Clarke.
Well, for as long as I can remember, it was just quite a long time, as you reminded me, Jonathan, the Tory party has been accused of being only the party of the wealthy, and we wouldn't have won many seats if that would ever actually been true. What we are is a party of free market economics combined with a social conscience, particularly a one-nation Tory like Michael or myself. We were trying to modernise the country, trying to keep up with the modern world, earn our living, look after our interest in the world, and make sure that the opportunities are spread and the benefits are spread as widely as we can. That's been doing that as long as we can. We get driven back to this idea that somehow we're helping millionaires. It's a corny line every time you have a general election. It has never actually been true. And the Conservative Party has been in office for a very large part of my adult life, I'm glad to say. And during that time, we've seen the emergence of opportunities and living standards for every section of society. We try to create a more meritocratic world, and Michael Gove's education reforms were a very important part of that. It was time we raised standards, times we concentrated on actually... Oh, good heavens, you don't want to go back to the... We had one of the poorest performing education systems in the world. We're in a school here of outstanding excellence, and we are getting more of those each year. But we have to have... If we're going to give opportunities to the dispossessed and everybody else, we can't go back to a situation where only a handful of the poorest pupils ever went to university. We can't go back to a situation where our education standards were falling miles behind those of countries like Singapore, and actually opening up the education system and taking it out of the hands of some bits of the education establishment. Very important step in that direction, okay, on behalf of the dispossessed and an opportunity meritocratic state.
Tim Farron.
I mean, I'm bound to just make a quick Gove remark, really, that British education could be better and improve, absolutely. That it has been improved by a person surrounded by special advisors in Whitehall dictating to teachers how to teach has absolutely set our schools back and been a massive challenge for us to deal with over the last 5 years. And, you know, I'm going to pay tribute to my colleague David Laws, who's basically been like a centre-half man marking Michael Gove for much of the last 2 or 3 years. But to answer the question, the dispossessed and the privileged, I think what we want, surely, is a society where everybody can contribute and where everybody gets a fair share and where everybody pays their fair share. And what I think offends so many people is the sense that if you are on a lower income, and if, for example, you are ever in a situation where you've been overpaid a tax credit or overpaid a benefit, then you are ruthlessly pursued for that and the state gets that out of you. And yet if you are Starbucks or if you're some multimillionaire and you've managed to get away without paying tax, then they let you get away with it. And that strikes me as being, if we're trying to get to a fairer society, you have to be in a position where we've won consent for the changes we want to make, and we lose consent for the changes we want to make our economy stronger and fairer, if you allow the very wealthiest to get away with it. Taxation is not an optional subscription, it is a mandatory charge for living in a civilised society, and everybody should pay it.
Phil Redmond.
I think this is another one of those really simple questions, but it's a very complex answer, really, because I think what is the dispossessed or the privileged for a Tory government? But then you remember the end of the Labour government was all about whether they were for the underprivileged or whether they were for Tony's cronies. You know? And I think, again, what it highlights is the disconnect that inevitably has developed in the country over the last 20-odd years or so, you know, between central government and localism. And I think it doesn't matter what the political party is or what your political persuasion is, I think that is the bigger issue. You know, I think the dispossessed are probably localism, and the privileged are probably the centralists.
You are from Merseyside. You're a
Yep.
Liverpool person through and through. Do you sense that? Is it your view that the that the party which has been powerful in Liverpool for half a century, the Labour Party, has failed to deliver for the people of things, or is that they haven't had the chance that they ought to have had?
Well, that's another one of those things that every political party would say that. Just give us another term and we'll move on. But remember that Labour has only been back in Liverpool in the last 4 or 5 years. It was Liberal Democrat for a long time. And so we ended up in Liverpool, as you do in most northern cities, being in a one-party state. And that itself is bad for democracy. And I think the difficulty, with most people, when you ask me, was I Labour? I said, well, I definitely was. I was a rabid Marxist in my teens. But the older I've gotten, the more I've moved on through life and everything, I find it extremely difficult recognising what is now called the Labour Party.
Because it's not what you think it ought to be?
No, I don't think it is. I don't think it's a kind of Labour movement like we used to do. And I think a lot of people from this part of the world would have more understanding of what Len McCluskey and Unite are trying to do, And that in itself is a legitimate process. I mean, they do fund 149 MPs. And so there is a sort of schism in the Labour Party called Labour Unite, And I think, but the bigger issue I keep coming back to, and I think where everybody was kind of where the great big society debate sort of grabbed everybody, whether they hated it, whether they loved it, because there seemed to be an offer for people to actually get involved and improve their own local communities. But I was part of that. I thought that was a good thing, coming out of what we'd done in capital culture. But it soon became obvious that what they meant by big society was actually big society controlled by the centralists in London, And that was it's an oxymoron. So I think the bigger challenge we've got is to somehow get these guys to realise that they can't run everything from 10 or 12 people sitting in a room in London. They've got to devolve. They've got to devolve the power, and they've got to devolve the responsibility and authority back to local agenda.
Suzanne Evans.
Well, if Cameron's trying to woo the dispossessed to the Tory party, he's going about it completely the wrong way. He's overseen massive cuts to benefits, those dreadful Atos-style disability tests, which have stripped people who are seriously ill of benefits and in some cases led them to suicide, and the rolling out of the bedroom tax. I think that man has got no idea what it's like to be poor or ill in Britain today. And I don't think many of his colleagues have either. And I also have to agree with Phil about the Labour Party. My great-grandfather stood for the Labour Party for Parliament in the 1920s. He was a miner. How many miners do we have in the Labour Party today? How many people do we have in Parliament who've done some sort of manual work?
You wouldn't get very far with just the miners.
That's very true. But I think my point is, the Labour Party used to be the party of the working classes, and it isn't anymore. And we've got far too many people in Parliament who are, in many senses, privileged. They've been to private schools, they've left and gone to university, they've studied PPE, they've got a job as a researcher for an MP, and then they've gone on to be MPs themselves, and a lot of them have never really actually done a hard day's work in their life. And one of the things I think about being here in a grammar school today is, of course, next door we had Harold Wilson, went to Wirral Boys Grammar School and became Prime Minister. The last Prime Minister we had who went to a grammar school was John Major, and we haven't had one since then. And I think we really do need to look at bringing back more grammar schools. It's something that 50% of the population actually want. And I think only till we get people achieving again from a young age and actually getting them into streamed education, which is also what young people want, will we not have any more people from poorer backgrounds into Parliament. And that's what I'd like to see.
Ken Clarke.
Well, I do think this is becoming at times a faint parody of what Parliament and other places are like. Just to come back on one thing, welfare reform was inevitable. I mean, it's every course when you tackle welfare reform, you're bound to have everything you do opposed, and then you're accused of not understanding the poor. The aim of the welfare reform, firstly to get the cost under control, but secondly to move it so that there was positive support for people getting into work, and ending welfare dependency was overdue. At the other end, the idea that all we've done is give privilege to the very wealthy. The Swiss secret bank accounts were in 2007. You can't have one now, if anybody here wants one, because we have an agreement. This government had an agreement with the Swiss and with Liechtenstein about actual disclosure. We've introduced a general anti-avoidance rule, which the lawyers always used to resist. George did this in the 2012 Finance Act, I think. I won't bore you with the details. But at the moment, at least in the newspapers, you can see very wealthy footballers. But a lot of other people are having tax demands taken from them for tax evasion. All the Labour Party did with the very rich was give them knighthoods. And I don't think they did a very great deal with the recession they caused for the very poor. It's no good parodying in the rather old-fashioned style now, oh, the Tories just give money away to the rich and they grind the poor under their heels. You might have got away with running that line in 1890s, but I don't think either UKIP or anybody else can really maintain it very sensibly today.